particularly in public health. This lesson will look at the origins of Britain's National Health Service, otherwise referred to as the NHS. Our aims are to identify developments in treatments and diagnosis in the 20th century, to explain how these improvements were made, but also to evaluate the progress in treatment and diagnosis in the 20th century. If you're going to write down this as a heading, do so now. If not, we'll carry on. Let's consider the tools of the trade when it comes to medicine: surgery, diagnosis, prevention, cure. So what do we know to date? Can you give examples of how we did these big four things before the 20th century? Pause the video here and see if you can make some notes on details of surgery, diagnosis, prevention and cure in the eras before the 20th century. So when it comes to surgery, you might have identified developments like the carbolic spray, an antiseptic which helped prevent infections. For diagnosis, you might have identified Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which linked germs to disease. For prevention, you might have identified Edward Jenner's vaccination. This one was for smallpox, remember. And for cures, you might have identified magic bullets and the work of people like Paul Ehrlich. Consider this statement. New test uses single drop of blood to reveal entire history of viral infections. Cheap and rapid test allows doctors to access a list of every virus that has infected or continues to infect a patient and could transform disease detection. Researchers have developed a cheap and rapid test that reveals a person's full history of viral infections from a single drop of blood. The test allows doctors to read out a list of viruses that have infected or continue to infect patients even when they have not caused any obvious symptoms. The technology means that GPs could screen patients for all of the viruses capable of infecting people. It could transform the detection of serious infections such as hepatitis C and HIV, which people can carry for years without knowing. The test could bring about major benefits for organ transplant patients. One problem that can follow transplant surgery is the unexpected reawakening of viruses that have lurked inactive in the patient or donor for years. These viruses can return in force when the patient's immune system is suppressed with drugs to prevent them rejecting the organ. Standard tests often fail to pick up latent viruses before surgery, but this procedure could reveal their presence and alert doctors to patients to the danger. Alright, so this is basically a news story about a new way of diagnosing viruses, but here's how we're going to use it. Explain how this testing could help in diagnosis. Secondly, explain how blood tests can help GPs, or in other words, general practitioners. These are the doctors that you go to for day-to-day ailments. And then explain the benefits of diagnosing illness in this way, if it's practical. You might even consider some of the disadvantages too, especially from a sort of moral point of view. Pause the video here while you study this text and answer those questions. Well, first of all, if you were able to get a blood test that was indeed able to detect all viruses that a person still had or the antibodies that they've got, but that could help diagnose whether they were at risk of developing future illnesses, or it might explain previous infections that they had. Also, this might help general practitioners to advise patients on their next steps. The benefits of diagnosing people in this way is it shows their entire viral history. In other words, all the diseases that they've ever had, any that they've still got, and any that might prove a problem in the future. However, is this article an example of treatment, diagnosis, or prevention? It's probably a mixture of diagnosis and prevention. After all, it's diagnosing what viruses a patient has or had, with a view to preventing those diseases causing problems down the line. So this is an example of diagnosis. This is where you identify what is wrong with someone. Even Hippocrates in ancient Greek times knew that. This is also an example of developments in science and technology during the 20th century that have helped this to happen. But also there are improvements in diagnosis that have helped treatments by targeting specific diseases. So let's have a look at developments in technology that have helped medicine. Technological developments. First of all, there's the introduction of things like scans and monitors. These machines scan the body to identify cancer and other illnesses. This can be done without the need for invasive surgery. Then we've got microscopes. These have been around for a while, but in the 20th century great advances were made with them. The electron microscope was invented in 1931, and it allows doctors to see much smaller objects, such as human cells, in much finer detail. Then we've got endoscopes, a camera inside a flexible tube which is passed into the body so that doctors can see inside the body without using invasive surgery. Endoscopes have only got smaller over time. And also nuclear medicine. Radioactive elements are injected into the bloodstream where they track and diagnose changes in the body through disease. What you want to do now is copy down this mind map and add an overall evaluation of how these developments helped medicine. Pause the video while you make these notes. We're now going to consider public health. This photograph shows an example of slum housing in Glasgow in around the year 1910. The blur on the baby's face is simply because the little baby couldn't sit still. But you might notice that the baby has got quite a fat tummy. That's not because he's well fed. In fact, that's a rather distended stomach. It shows that this baby is not getting enough food to eat. The mother herself looks in fairly poor health. She appears to have sores around her mouth. She looks tired and listless and quite skinny. If you want to get an idea of just how small a woman she was, compare her to the chair that she's next to. Then have a look at the house that they're in. They've got a fireplace, but this also serves as a main cooking area too. There's dirt on the floors. It appears to be some sort of poster that's peeling off the wall, or perhaps just some sort of wall covering that's been repurposed. And very little furniture. This really is a bad place to be living. So how did these conditions improve over the course of the 20th century? One of the big breakthroughs came in 1944. In 1944, a report by Government Minister William Beveridge, that's him in the photograph there, set out what the government could do to make Britain a better place to live after the Second World War was won. Similar thoughts were had after World War I, but actually more was done after World War II. Beveridge's report laid the foundation for the welfare state and what we now call the National Health Service. Many British people saw this as their reward for fighting and suffering through the tough years of the war. Now we have the opportunity to make some notes on what William Beveridge's report involved, what it recommended, and ultimately what it did. Firstly, it guaranteed free healthcare for all, free at the point of delivery. In other words, when you needed help, it was there without you having to pay for it at the moment that you needed it. After all, the sick can't always hang around to try and save the money. This is the origins of the National Health Service that we have today. This is sort of covered by the idea that people were to be cared for by the country itself from cradle to grave, and indeed slightly before when they were born. So the idea was that your mother would be cared for while she was pregnant, the NHS and other health services would help you when you were born, and then it would care for you throughout your life until the moment that you died, after which, if you didn't have money yourself, a basic funeral would be provided. Welfare payments were to be paid to help the disabled and the unemployed, particularly where the disabled were prevented from getting work by their disability. Also, this involved helping the jobless back into work. Slums were to be cleared away and rebuilt by better quality council housing and other houses. After all, many slums in the cities had been damaged by bombing in the war anyway. Pensions and care for the elderly were provided by the government. Remember that this is a process started by Lloyd George's liberal reforms in the early 20th century. And lastly, schooling was to be for all, for free of charge, and it was to last up until the age of 14. In the 1960s, this was raised to the age of 16. Typically these days, people stay in education or training until about the age of 18 or even beyond. So, pause the video while you make your own version of this diagram, and you could always extend this with further research of your own, but this kind of sums up what Beveridge recommended and what shape the welfare state took after World War II. Once you're ready, press play and we'll continue to the next stage. Create a diagram like this one with plenty of space underneath to extend your notes. The welfare state provided for children, for adults and their families, and for the elderly too. So those should be your three headings. So, draw a diagram like the one shown. Write the factors under the correct headings, and the factors you'll see in just a moment. Then as an extension, Who was helped most by the welfare state? Adults and families, children, or the elderly? Explain your choice. Right, so here's what's going to happen. In a moment, I'm going to put on the screen a grid covered in different factors which you need to write under those headings. So first things first, pause the video here and get this diagram and the headings down. Once you've done that, press play. Done? Alright, well on the next screen you're going to see the grid. You can always flip back to this part of the video to see the extension. Let's see what the factors are. And read them for yourself, or if you're just taking notes, I'll quickly read through them. Baby clinics, unemployed pay, which is sometimes referred to as the dole. Free child and healthcare in schools. Payments to top up low pay. Retirement homes, medical training, maternity leave and pay, cheap medicine, retirement pensions, home help for the old, pensions for the disabled, family allowances, free hospitals, free doctors, cheap or free baby food and milk, education to 14 years old and later older, meals at home for the elderly, funeral help, free school meals, or at the very least very cheap, and then sick pay. Okay, pause the video here, place these factors under the correct headings, and then we'll see what you should have identified. Check your answers and make any necessary corrections. After that, does this diagram support the idea of the state or government providing support from cradle to the grave? Explain your view with examples. So here are the factors for children. Check your answers now. Here are the first set of answers for adults and their families, rather. Here's the next set. And here are the factors for the elderly. Okay, pause the video here and decide on your answer for this second part of this. Well, probably you've identified that this does sort of support the idea of supporting people from cradle to grave. After all, it supports people as their children, as they grow up and have families of their own, and as they reach the end of their life too. So how was this possible? Well, something we need to understand is the political situation at the time that made it possible, specifically the 1945 general election, held actually just shortly before the end of World War II. In July of 1945, with World War II still going on, Britain had a general election, although it should be pointed out that the immediate threat of war with Germany had gone because Germany had surrendered, but the war was still going on in the Pacific against Japan. Votes had been cast in May, but because of the many servicemen still abroad, and they needed to vote after all, the result had been delayed while their votes were collected and counted. Most of the world expected the heroic figure of Winston Churchill to win, but he did not. Here are the results. The Conservative Party got 36.2% of the vote. That gave them 197 MPs. The Liberal Party got 9% of the vote and 12 MPs. The National Liberals, who were split away from the main Liberal Party, got 2.9% of the vote and got 11. Yes, I know that seems a little bit strange, but that's the first past the post electoral system for you, and if you need information on that, I expect there are videos on YouTube to help you. However, the really significant result here is for the Labour Party. They got 48% of the vote and a massive 393 seats. Again, you might not think that they're that far ahead of the Conservative Party, but remember, in Britain, we have a first-past-the-post system where whoever wins the seat in a particular area basically gets the seat in Parliament. So, why would Labour's strong win make it easier to make the changes that Beveridge recommended? Note down an answer, and then we'll see what you think. Ultimately, governments, when they're making big changes, like Beveridge's recommendations, need to have lots of power in government. It is very difficult for the Conservatives and the Liberal Party to gang up together and defeat the Labour Party. Assuming all those Labour members of Parliament agree with the changes, they're always going to support them, which means that they can get the changes in the law and the policies through Parliament with very little hassle. Let's consider the nature of the Labour government in 1945. There's the Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, smoking a pipe. Not particularly healthy, Clement. He was described by Winston Churchill as "a sheep in sheep's clothing." Not a very flattering image. The Labour Party won by a landslide majority, which means a huge majority of seats in Parliament. The Prime Minister, as I've said, was Clement Attlee. They managed this by promising to deliver big improvements in healthcare, education and care for the poor and ordinary people, exactly what was being promised by the Beveridge Report. These were all fairly socialist ideas, far more left-wing than we experience these days, but I'm not going to get dragged into a political debate over this. They wasted little time in getting started, so they started making their changes to health pretty much immediately. The person put in charge of this was Aneurin, better known as Nye Bevan, a Welshman with a poor background who really wanted to change things. The minister in charge of establishing the National Health Service was Aneurin Bevan. Bevan was from a poor working-class community in South Wales. He experienced hardship and saw the effects of poverty and poor health on the Welsh mining community in which he grew up. He hated laissez-faire politics. He also hated Churchill's Conservative Party and was very vocal about this. And he believed that governments had a duty to help the poor and the sick. So let's get some notes down about Aneurin Nye Bevan. Put down his name first of all. Then how were Bevan's ideas different to the 19th century? Then secondly, what about his background might explain this difference? If you're unfamiliar with laissez-faire politics and the way that governments behaved in the 19th century, you might want to view some of my other lessons first. In the meantime though, pause the video while you complete those tasks. Well, the big difference here is that Aneurin Bevan and the Labour government are trying to change things in a really big way. This is sometimes referred to as radical reform. Comparatively, in the 19th century, laissez-faire politics literally means do nothing or do very little. They didn't believe it was the government's job to get involved in people's everyday lives. Nye Bevan disagreed with this. He felt that it was the government's responsibility to try and help people, and if that meant meddling in people's lives, raising taxes, or controlling things, then that was a price worth paying. It's still a political debate that we have until this day. So what about his background might explain this? Well, being that he was from a poor community, he probably felt that there was a lot of inequality in the world. He didn't want other people to suffer as he had seen Welsh people suffering in his poor community in South Wales at the early part of the 20th century. By getting into government, he saw his opportunity to try and do that. So what was the National Health Service? Well, note down this heading and the key date, 1948, when the NHS was established. We've seen a lot of laws since we began studying the 20th century, but what other ones are there? So there's the Public Health Act in the 19th century of 1848, the Second Public Health Act of 1875, and the National Insurance Act of 1911. But what does this tell us about the role of governments in improving healthcare? Well, quite simply, governments are getting more and more involved in public health. Put together, the NHS and the other reforms, like the Liberal reforms, create a welfare state with the idea that the government looks after people from cradle to grave. Hopefully you've got that point now. It's not because it's welfare. So as a task, write your own definition of this term, welfare state. You can refer to some of the examples you've seen elsewhere in this lesson, or some of the information that is included on this slide. Pause the video while you note down your definition. So why have a National Health Service? Not everyone in the United Kingdom agrees with the National Health Service, but actually most opinion polls show that it has very, very strong broad support. This is known as consensus politics, a rare point where most people agree that the NHS is something that they like. Firstly, let's consider the reasons why it was created. Connections were made between poor health and poor housing. There was the introduction of the National Insurance Scheme in 1911, but that was limited. It didn't cover women, children, the elderly or the infirm. The NHS changed that. There was the economic depression between World War II and after World War I and World War II, and after World War II. And people were still using family remedies and quack medicines that weren't very effective. There was also the impact of World War II. People felt that they were owed a National Health Service for going through the suffering and pain of the war. So why were some people against the NHS? Local authorities and voluntary hospitals would lose powers and be taken over. Many of these had done good work before the war, and they were nervous about losing this. There were also arguments over costs. Britain was virtually bankrupted by World War II, How on earth could they expect to pay for such a hugely expensive thing? But also there was the British Medical Association, which feared that doctors would lose some of their income. The BMA is a group that represents the interests of doctors. Some tasks then. People who supported the NHS would point to the evidence on the left as to why it was needed. Reasons why some people thought it was a bad idea are shown on the right. So which argument, for or against the NHS, is the easiest to support in your view? Consider not only the quantity of evidence, because obviously there are 5 bits on one side and only 3 points on the other, but also consider the strength of the evidence. Make your mind up, write down your answer, and support it with examples. Pause the video while you do so. Hopefully in coming to your answer, you've done this based upon the strength of the examples and not just how many there are. We're going to look now at the reaction to the creation of the NHS. Here is a cartoon that will help us do this. We're going to do an exam style question based upon this. In the picture, we can see Aneurin Bevan, carrying a briefcase labelled Health for All, walking down Harley Street. Harley Street was, and in fact is, a very popular street in London for private clinics and private doctors. In other words, ones that you would have to pay for rather than ones available for free on the NHS. Look how the doctors are all looking nervously out of their windows as Aneurin Bevan walks down the road. But some are preparing to do something. People in surgical kit are preparing a tripwire. Presumably, once he trips over that, they're going to deal with Aneurin Bevan. This cartoon is a newspaper cartoon from 1948, the year that the National Health Service came into effect. As I've said, it shows Aneurin Bevan walking down Harley Street, a London street famous for private clinics where wealthy people would pay for private doctors. So consider first of all the content. What does the source show? Pause the video and note down your thoughts now. What do you think is the origin of this? Well, it's from a British newspaper published in 1948. What might be the significance of the date? And what is its purpose? Is it to show that not everyone was in favour of the NHS? Well, who was against it? Here's the exam style question then. This is only a 4-mark question, it won't take you long, and if you found a question like this in the exam, it would have the structure underneath to help you. What can you infer from this source about the establishment of the National Health Service? I can infer a detail in the source that tells me this. I can infer a detail in the source that tells me this. And remember, your inferences need to go beyond the obvious, and they must be related to the establishment of the National Health Service to be relevant. Pause the video, spend no more than about 6 minutes doing this question, and then we'll have a look at what sort of answer you should have come up with. Let's have a look at a sample answer then. What can you infer from this source about the establishment of the National Health Service? I can infer that private doctors oppose the NHS. Detail in the source that tells me this, the doctors are shown trying to trip up Bevan. I can infer that Aneurin Bevan was determined to deliver the NHS. Detail in the source that tells me this, he is shown walking determinedly, carrying a case saying Health for All. You might very well have picked up on different details, and that's no problem. Just make sure that your inferences are related to the establishment of the NHS. If you're unsure, maybe improve it by noting down some of the things that I've come up with. So finally, advances in medicine. Let's consider medicine before the 1900s, the 19th century, and then medicine after the 1900s, the 20th century. Before, people were fond of cure-all remedies. These don't actually exist. But afterwards, new medicines such as aspirin are used as a painkiller to remedy for fevers. This is a very common thing. Before, treatments were passed down through families. But in the 20th century, new antibiotics such as magic bullets and penicillin were developed. If you don't know much about penicillin, I do have a lesson on that as well. Medical books were made for minor home use. But now custom drugs were aimed at specific health problems due to genetic conditions such as Huntington's disease. Before, there were in-home treatments. Some hospitals with improved nursing were available, remember the contributions of Florence Nightingale, but the doctors needed to be paid. But now in the United Kingdom, we have universal healthcare through the National Health Service, increasingly professional health services, and free for all to use. So firstly, Describe the ways in which medicine has progressed in the 20th century. Use some of these examples or some of your own. Then explain what factors, for example technology, help bring about this progress. And then lastly, in your view, what was the most significant development in the 20th century? Pause the video while you consider that. Hopefully you have identified that many of the advances are due to increased knowledge and technology. So the factors that help include technology, things like X-rays, microscopes for understanding microbes, cells, but also things like DNA. There are so many to choose from. What is the most significant development in the 20th century medicine? Well, that's very much up to you. But just make sure that whatever you've chosen, you've supported it with specific examples, rather than just a gut feeling. And with that, we'll finish this lesson here. Thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and goodbye.